I'd like to talk about some common mistakes to avoid in order to get God's direction. And I want to acknowledge that I have been greatly aided by many years ago a couple of lectures I heard from Dr. J.I. Packer. We have a theological lectureship every year at the Moody Bible Institute, and I was in charge of it this particular year. And so Dr. J.I. Packer was the individual that we asked to come, and he gave perhaps some of the best messages on God's will. And here are these ideas of mistakes or to avoid. I'm indebted to thoughts he helped form in my mind, so I want to acknowledge that. Of course, everything we receive we owe to the Lord and usually somebody that He's used. And so I pray that in some way you would be aided. I'd like to, in this little message on mistakes to avoid, the first mistake is an unwillingness to think ahead. An unwillingness to think ahead. God is rebuking His people in Deuteronomy 32 verses 28 and 29, where He says, "You're a nation lacking in counsel, and there's no understanding in you." He says, "Would that you would be wise, that you would understand this, that you would discern your future." See, an unwillingness to think ahead shows a lack of understanding, a lack of wisdom, a lack of being sensitive to God's counsel. You see, it's wise to think of the long-term consequences of an action. Something in the moment can sound fun, it can sound pleasurable, but the long-term consequences, maybe it's not so good. Now, in regard to God's direction, let's just look at an example. Let's say a person is thinking about whether or not to marry this boy or this girl, this young man, this young lady. And let's say their criteria of whether to marry this person was totally upon physical appearance. Well, you say, wow, I'm just such a beautiful girl or such a handsome young man, or certainly they have to realize, if they thought very long at all or ask God for wisdom, Lord, would you help me see this from your perspective, that person's going to look radically different 20 years from now. So if they make that decision totally on physical appearance, that would be a mistake to avoid. There's nothing wrong with being attracted to someone, but think of the long-term consequences. There are people who may be heroes in the high school annual that may not be such a good marriage partner a number of years out. So an unwillingness to think ahead is certainly a mistake to avoid. Another mistake to avoid is an unwillingness to take advice. An unwillingness to take advice, especially from people who know us best. Now, sometimes when we have a strong desire for something, you say, we know what's best. We don't need to hear from anybody. We don't want to hear from anybody. But in Proverbs 12 and verse 23, it says, Proverbs 12:23, I think I'm saying the right verse there. Actually, it's Proverbs 12:15 is the verse I want to give you. The Proverbs 12:15. "The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man is he who listens to counsel." And a willingness to take advice. And it may be sometimes from individuals. I'll just give you a couple of illustrations. I remember when I was completing my seminary program and I was looking at various doctoral programs to study in. And I wrote a number of letters seeking advice from individuals who were learned men in institutions, but I also wrote my mother. Now my mother, a dear, sweet, godly lady, she's with the Lord now. My mother, a very smart lady, she graduated valedictorian in our high school class, but she never went to college. She didn't have the means or the encouragement, so she went to work, and as she married my father, she helped get him through a couple of degrees. But here my mother didn't have a college degree, but out of all the letters I received back in regard to aiding me and guiding me in regard to where to go in regard to my doctoral program, her letter is the only one I saved. her letter was the most helpful because he so knew me. I could have said, well, my mother has not studied at that level and she really wouldn't know, but her advice was very, very, very helpful. I remember another occasion that my mother was not one to try to tell me what to do or try to rule my life, but her counsel was very, very helpful. I can remember a time I was asking her about a particular young lady in regard to, this was a godly young lady, and there was an opportunity to spend some time with her. And as I recounted this later, my mother's actions, she was sort of surprised she even did this, but she told me very, very strongly, no, I would not advise that. Well, there was nothing wrong with that young lady. She was a very godly young lady. But I can see now it wasn't just a right fit. And God had many more years of singleness for me, and He also had a wonderful person that was designed for me. And so you see, I'm so grateful for her advice. I did heed that advice, and I'm so grateful for that. I can see the wisdom of it in a way that I couldn't fully understand the wisdom of it at the moment. So, mistakes to avoid. 2 mistakes we've talked about. An unwillingness to think ahead and think about the long-term consequences of a decision. And secondly, an unwillingness to take advice. May God give you wisdom and even the right godly counsel into your life that you can avoid these mistakes.